go even further beyond!
That's a lot of damage.
Yo guys, what is up? Max for a Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over my Hammer of the Ancients build. Now, I put this build together on some shoestring gear, just kind of like looking for the bare minimum, and it was already one-shotting most things. I spent some time getting some better rolls, and now this build is hitting for 10 million damage. It just feels awesome to play. I know one of the biggest and most asked questions I'm going to get asked on this video is this better than the Whirlwind Barbarian? And the answer isn't a simple yes or no. There's pros and cons to both, which I plan to explain to you throughout this video. This build feels a bit like playing a fighting game where you've got a bit of a setup, a bit of a combo you need to do, and if you do that combo correctly, then you can hit for millions of damage. I hope you guys enjoy the build guide. We're going to be going over everything, absolutely everything you need to know. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get right into it. So the very first thing I need to talk to you about this build is our max damage scenario. The max damage scenario is all of the things that need to go right in order for us to deal the most possible damage with this build. And the first thing we need to look at is the weapon expertise. Now, we are going to be using the two-handed mace expertise with this build, as we're using Hammer of the Ancients, which is a two-handed mace weapon attack, and the expertise reads, when using two-handed mace, lucky hit up to a 10% chance to gain 2 fury when hitting an enemy. Double the amount of fury gained while berserking. You deal 15% increased critical strike damage to stunned and vulnerable enemies while berserking. So in order for us to deal the most possible damage with this build, we need a few things to happen. The first is that enemies that we're hitting is vulnerable. We're going to be stacking a ton of vulnerable damage on this build. Next up, we need to be dealing critical strikes. It's really important to critical strike. We're going to deal increased critical strike damage while berserking. So the next thing that we need is berserking. We're going to be dealing more damage while berserking, and this build is going to benefit a lot if we have the berserk status on us. And lastly, that enemy needs to be stunned. Stunned enemies are going to take more damage from us, and we're going to increase our crit damage against stunned enemies. So the 4 things that we need to have in order to deal the most damage with this build is vulnerable, crit, stun, berserking, and the way I've set up this skill tree and the way I've set up my aspects is so that all of these conditions are met as often as possible. Now, the combo that we're doing with this build in order to try to hit all 4 of those scenarios as often as possible goes as follows. So to start us off, we're using the exploit glyph. This glyph reads, when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This effect cannot happen more than once every 20 seconds per enemy. This is guaranteed vulnerable whenever we hit an enemy, and we have 3 seconds upon proccing vulnerable to delete them. And this is the first step to hitting that max damage scenario. The next thing is that we need a skill to proc that, and we're using Lunging Strike. Lunging Strike is a fantastic skill. It's got high lucky hit chance. It's a movement skill, and with our specialization, critical strikes with it will grant us berserking for 1.5 seconds. So now we've got a lunge towards an enemy that is going to proc them with vulnerable. If it crits, which we've got really high crit chance on this build, it's going to give us berserking. So we've got 2 of those scenarios filled. Next up, further down in the skill tree, we've got the concussion node. This reads, skills using bludgeoning weapons have a 30% chance to stun enemies for 3.25 seconds, or up to a 45% chance on lucky hits when using a two-handed bludgeoning weapon. So now our lunging strike can give us berserking, it can give us vulnerable, and it can stun that enemy, as well as our hammer follow-up attack will also make everything else vulnerable and can also stun things, and then we can do another hammer attack following up on all that stun, and that's kind of our combo basically. We're lunging, striking around, going to be giving ourselves berserking, giving us stuns, giving us vulnerable, and then following up with a swift blow from our hammer to deal the most possible damage. Last thing I need to mention before we get into our gear is one of the most important multipliers for Hammer of the Ancients, and that is Hammer of the Ancients deals 1% additional damage for each point of fury you had when using it. Now, I haven't had the time to min-max all of my gear, but a really great stat to find on your gear for this build is additive increased fury. If you find a piece of gear that gives you plus 12 fury, that is plus 12% for your Hammer of the Ancients. So definitely be on a lookout for that. I've prioritized additional Fury in my Paragon board, but I was not able to find it on my gear for this build video. So just know that additive Fury is very, very nice to find when you're building this build. Now let's go over my gear, and we're going to be doing stat priorities for each slot. One thing to note about my gear that I'm wearing on this build is it is not min-maxed. I did not have like 6 days to like perfect this build like I did Whirlwind. So the gear that I'm using is all right, but you guys could definitely push it further, and I'm going to be telling you what to look for. So to start us off, we're using a cooldown helmet. Cooldown is the #1 most important stat for a Barbarian, especially after the cooldown nerfs, and the aspect that I'm using is each point of Fury generated while at maximum Fury grants you Fortify. Fortify is a fantastic layer of defense for the Barbarian. We're going to deal more damage when we have Fortify, and it'll give us increased damage reduction. Now, one thing to note is I am using the stacking health gems as opposed to the damage reduction while fortified gems, because this build does not get to consume as much Fury as the Whirlwind build does. It does not get to be as fortified as it does when we're proccing all those lucky hits and fortifying like crazy. So when we're not fortified, I found the max health gems helped me tank more damage. Next up, we've got a chest piece. The big priority here is ranks of Challenging Shout. Challenging Shout is going to give us damage reduction, and then your secondary priority is more damage reduction from enemies. And I've imprinted the increased armor. This is just like, I think, a must-have attribute or aspect on any endgame build. Next up, we've got our gauntlets. On our gauntlets, #1 priority is ranks 2 Hammer of the Ancients, and then if you can get as much crit chance as possible, this build massively benefits from crit chance. So we've got crit chance against injured enemies, which is around 30%, and then critical strike chance. And we've imprinted the aspect distant enemies have an 8% chance to get stunned. You deal 36% increased damage to stunned enemies. Now, we are going to be stunning enemies pretty often with this build. There was a big decision between putting the Quake on the hammer on our weapon or putting the Quake on the hammer on our gloves. Now, what I decided to do was put the Quake on our hammer. Note that this isn't a damage multiplier. It's not Hammer of the Ancients quakes outwards, dealing increased damage. It's just a percentage of the damage that is dealt. I picked putting this on the weapon, even though it isn't a big damage multiplier, because it's quality of life. Hitting enemies all around you, all for equal damage, to me, felt better than hitting one enemy really hard and all the enemies around not as hard. And I found my clear speed was pretty great with this. If you want to go for the highest possible single damage numbers, you would move the stun multiplier to the weapon for a bigger damage instance. But note that the stun multiplier doesn't work the most time on bosses anyways. So that is why I made that decision. Next up, we've got the Temerity pants. Still not sure if I'm saying that correctly. These pants read effects that heal you beyond 100% life, grant you a barrier. Barrier is another form of survivability on this build. We're healing a ton, and we have the multiplier. When we have a barrier, we deal more damage. If you do not have these pants, you're looking for damage reduction just as much as you can get, plus max health on your pants, and you should use the aspect when you damage an elite, you get a barrier. This barrier will give you survivability and also the damage multiplier without needing these unique pants. Next up, we've got my boots. Now, these are probably the worst piece of gear on my build. The #1 priority for your boots are movement speed after killing an elite, and fury reduction. The fury reduction on this build is very, very nice to have. Movement speed is also always really great, but I went with the skill damaging an enemy with a core skill has a 36% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 1 second, double this duration if it was a critical strike. With our lucky strike chance on our hammer, at base, we have about an 18% chance to extend the duration of berserking. The reason I went with this is because berserking is such a massive damage increase for this build, as when we are berserking, if you remember the expertise, we get more fury back when we hit enemies, and we deal more damage. So having berserking up was definitely a priority for me, and this is the aspect we're doing it with. I note that my berserking is up more often than not, because even though our lucky hit chance with this isn't great, when we're hammering, we're hitting like 8 to 10 enemies at least, so pretty nice there, and we're always critically striking, or not always, but we're critically striking a pretty damn good amount of time. Now for our weapons, the stat priority is the same as it was for Whirlwind. The #1 most important stat to have is damage to vulnerable, which you'll note I do not have on this weapon, so I would be dealing even more damage. I think we could easily hit 12 mil if I had some more increased damage to vulnerable enemies. I do not. The next priority is crit damage. Crit damage is super important. The next most important is strength, and the last most important is a conditional damage multiplier that is going to be up as often as possible, aka damage to close enemies or damage with core skills are my two favorites. On my weapon, I've got crit damage, damage to slowed, close, and strength with our Hammer of the Ancient quaking outwards, and definitely go for the gems that increase your critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Next up on my weapons, I've got vulnerable damage, crit, damage to close, core skill. Whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 20% of the base damage dealt as additional bleeding damage. We're hitting a ton of damage. The bleed damage, if you don't one-shot, will usually carry out and kill enemies. And once again, we're trying to be up berserking as much as possible. On my sword, we've got core skill damage, strength, crit damage, vulnerable damage, and dealing damage while you have a barrier active is increased. And on my Demon Blade, or sorry, my two-handed weapon, we've got vulnerable damage, damage over time, damage to close, and strength. And each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill increased damage. Now we've got our rings. The stat priorities are vulnerable damage, crit chance, crit damage, resource generation, and additive fury. And we're using the bold chieftain aspect, which is the best aspect in the game for the Barbarian. It's really hard to find, as I'm sure some of you have already been looking for it. It's going to reduce the cooldowns of our shouts whenever we do those shouts nearby enemies. Those are the priorities for both of your rings. On my other ring, I'm using your shout skills generate 3 fury per second while active. Super fantastic to have. It's going to give us a ton of fury. This is the best fury generator aspect for Barbarian when you get your shout cooldowns lower, because you're always going to be generating fury. And lastly, I've got my amulet. I'm prioritizing cooldown and fury cost reduction on this. And then we've got the aspect skills deal increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit when you have full primary resource, which when we slam Hammer of the Ancients, you're going to note that we slam, it comes back, slam, slam, and we're able to slam a bunch of times with like almost full resource, which is really, really good damage for this build. Next up, we've got our skill tree. Now I'm going to go through the core of the skill tree, and then I'm going to show you where these 8 possible points could go. So to start us off, we're grabbing Lunging Strike, gives us Berserk when we critical strike. Then we've got Hammer of the Ancients and the Furious Hammer of the Ancients, more damage when we have more Fury. This is a no-brainer, much better than the Violent Hammer of the Ancients. Next up, we're grabbing our shouts. These are our triple shouts, going to give us Berserking and damage, going to give us Fury, health, and damage reduction, and movement speed and Fury generation. Next up, we're going over to Booming Voice. Our shouts last longer. Our shouts heal us for 3% of our maximum life. This is so nice. It's 9% of our life per second. Great to have. Then we've got damage reduction while berserking and increased fury generation while we're berserking. Great to have. More fury, more damage. Then we're grabbing the Pit Fighter, increased damage to close enemies and increased crit chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. When we hit enemies with bleed, which we are doing, we get that increased critical strike chance against them, which is fantastic stuff. And then we come down into this skill tree, and we're grabbing Wallop. Now, Wallop gives our bludgeoning weapons 15% increased damage if an enemy is stunned or vulnerable. We're making enemies stunned. We're always making them vulnerable. And this was new. I grabbed this because it gives us the stun. We're going to get a chance to stun enemies when we use our attacks, and we're getting that big stun multiplier. In addition to that, we're also using Tempered Fury. Increase your maximum fury by 3, but mainly here just moving down to grab the Invigorating Fury. Heal for 9% of your maximum life for each 100 fury spent. Now note that when we go over to my Hammer of Ancients, even with my reductions, Hammer of the Ancients costs 56. So every 2 slams of Hammer of the Ancients, I am getting back 9% of my health, which works really, really well with Wrath of the Berserker. Now, I was originally torn between using Stomp and Wrath of the Berserker, or trying to use them both together. In the current state of Barbarian, you kind of have to use a resource generator. I don't think you needed to before the nerfs, but when I was using Stomp, it was great setup for my abilities, but I was struggling with Fury, and I found that Wrath of the Berserker just feels a lot better. One, because it's another source of Unstoppable, but also it's going to give us 30% increased Fury regeneration, and this passive pairs so well with the build. While Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend increases Berserk damage bonus by 25%. Note that my Hammer does 56 fury or costs 56 fury. So boom, 25 increased damage. Boom, 25% increased damage. And you're just kind of like slamming away, ranking up damage, and you hit so hard. And that obviously pairs really well with Unbridled Rage. Now, for these last 8 skill points, there's a few places to spend them. Obviously, you could spend them on your shouts. You could prioritize which shouts feel good to you. Getting damage reduction to me is really important for survivability. So I usually max out my challenging shout. However, if you're doing lower level content, you could max War Cry, or if you're having resource regeneration issues, you can max out Rallying Cry. Now we have these 4 points. Now, I originally didn't have points in Pressure Point. Your core skills have a 10% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. This is fine if an enemy lives past that 3 seconds vulnerable. If an enemy lives past that 3 seconds vulnerable, we have to wait 20 seconds to make them vulnerable again, because we have no other way of making them vulnerable, and that feels really, really bad. However, if you've got enough damage that you can kill everything in 3 seconds, you don't need these points. However, just for the quality of life that these give, if an enemy does survive your first 3 seconds, not being able to vulnerable them really does hurt. So we're grabbing Pressure Point, which means we can't put points into counter offensive increased damage while we have Fortify, which is a bit of a bummer. So this last point, since we can't reach that, I'm just going to put into the resource regeneration, because more resource, more damage with this build. So that's how I've spec'd that. If you don't want to put these points into Pressure Point here, you could easily put them into the counter offensive to deal increased damage when we're fortified for more than 50% of our max life. Next up, we've got the Paragon board. Now, the Paragon board is very similar to my Whirlwind Barbarian build, but I prioritized something very different. And what I prioritized is Max Fury. I grabbed a ton of Max Fury nodes, and remember, for each point of Fury that we have when we cast Hammer the Ancients, we're going to be dealing percentage increased damage, which is a fantastic multiplier. So in this board, this is the Warbringer board, and the Warbringer has double nodes of increased Fury. We've got increased Fury and Fury on kill, maximum Fury, Fury on kill, maximum Fury, Fury on kill, maximum Fury. This is fantastic for killing enemies, getting that Fury back to make the next hit deal more damage. And we've got more Fury, maximum Fury, more life, maximum Fury. These 2 clusters will make the build hit way harder than a lot of the other things, which is really, really great. We also grab the Warbringer node to give us Fortify for every 75 Fury we spend. Spam Hammer, Fortify, give us defense. And we've also got damage while fortified and Fortify generation. So I think that the Warbringer board is a must-have for this build. But for our other boards, we are using the Vulnerable Glyph. We need to make enemies vulnerable to deal more damage to them. We've got the Hunter-Killer node with a ton of damage to elites. This is going to help us snipe elites and deal that max hit to them. We've got the Martial Glyph. The Martial Glyph is really important for decreasing the cooldowns of our shouts. This is a must-have glyph once you start playing Barbarian, because shouts are so important. And we grab the increased strength and physical damage. And then next we go, by the way, that was the Weapons Master board for our second board. And our third board that we went into is the Decimator board, where we're putting Disembowel. Killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. We are going to be bleeding with our hammer. One thing that I forgot to mention is that we are using the two-handed sword expertise. 20% of our damage is dealt as bleed, which helps us use that node where when we kill a bleeding enemy, we're going to get, we have the possibility of getting cooldowns on our shouts, which is really, really great. And then we can also grab more damage to vulnerable enemies in this board and more damage to vulnerable enemies. And then lastly, we got the Warbringer node, which I already explained. Now that you've seen all the moving pieces for this build, I can quickly explain that this build is as good as the Whirlwind build for a lot of content, but it is not as good as Whirlwind for Nightmare Dungeon pushing. And the simple reason for that is Whirlwind has better sustained DPS. Whirlwind can spin on a boss for a minute, while this build, if the boss doesn't die in 3 to 4 hits, you kind of get this awkward part where you have to like get your fury back and you have to start basic attacking, and you lose out on damage over the course of like a minute. However, Whirlwind can just keep spinning and keep outputting damage. So for like Nightmare Dungeon pushing, I still recommend the Whirlwind build. However, if you're just blasting and deleting normal dungeons, Hell Tides, PvP, whatever, this build just one-shots literally everything that you'll come across, and it's so much fun to use. Guys, that is going to do it for the build video. I know this video was a little bit longer, but it's really important for me to explain everything that I'm doing so that when you go and do it in your game, you understand the decisions to make and what things to prioritize. If you guys do enjoy these in-depth build explanations, I really do appreciate you hitting the subscribe button. 82% of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. So if you like these build explanations and you want to see more, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I am gearing up to start making builds for a new class, and I'd love your guys' input on what class you would like to see. I'm not quite sure what I want to go yet. I'm a little bit torn between like Sork and Druid, but let me know down below. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.